Over the past few decades, Indian companies have spent tens of billions of dollars acquiring companies across the United States, Britain, Germany, France, Canada, Italy, Australia, and beyond. Sometimes rescuing struggling businesses, sometimes buying technology, and sometimes taking control of brands that once represented the industrial power of the West itself. Today, we are looking at some of the biggest, strangest, and most important Western companies ever acquired by Indian businesses, including several you probably had no idea were Indian-owned. This is the story of how India is buying the West. At number one, we have one of the biggest and most symbolic deals in Indian corporate history. In 2007, Tata Steel bought Corus Group, a massive Anglo-Dutch steel company, for around £6.2 billion, roughly $12 billion at the time. And this was not an easy deal. Tata had to fight a fierce bidding war against Brazil's CSN, with both companies repeatedly raising their offers. In the end, Tata won. At the time, it became the largest overseas acquisition ever made by an Indian company. But Corus was not just another steel company. It had been created through the merger of British Steel and the Dutch company Koninklijke Hoogovens. It employed tens of thousands of people across the United Kingdom and the Netherlands, and its history was deeply connected to Europe's industrial rise. So when Tata Steel took control, the impact was impossible to ignore. Almost overnight, Tata became one of the largest steel producers in the world. A company from India, once ruled by Britain, had now taken control of one of Britain's most important industrial businesses. Corus, now operating as Tata Steel Europe, never returned to British ownership. Nearly 2 decades after the acquisition, an Indian company headquartered in Mumbai still plays a major role in deciding the future of British steelmaking. And for many people, that fact alone is surprising. Now, before we move on to other Indian companies, we need to stay with Tata for a little longer, because Corus was not the only deal. Over the years, different Tata companies went on an extraordinary global buying spree, acquiring businesses across several other industries. And some of these names are so famous that you may have known them your entire life without ever realizing they were owned by an Indian company. So before turning to other Indian companies, it is worth looking at the full scale of Tata's global expansion. The second deal we're looking at is Tata Motors' acquisition of Jaguar Land Rover. In 2008, Tata Motors bought Jaguar and Land Rover from Ford for $2.3 billion. At the time, both British luxury brands were struggling, and Ford was trying to sell them during the global financial crisis. The deal raised plenty of eyebrows. Tata Motors was still widely known for affordable cars in India, so many analysts questioned why it would spend billions on 2 loss-making luxury brands. But in hindsight, the move turned out to be transformative. Jaguar Land Rover went on to become one of Tata Motors' most important businesses, and for years contributed a major share of the company's revenue and profits. And that is what makes this acquisition so remarkable. 2 of Britain's iconic automotive brands, associated with luxury, heritage, royalty, and even James Bond, are ultimately owned by an Indian company. This was not just another overseas acquisition. It became one of the most famous examples of an Indian company taking control of struggling global brands and turning them into a major part of its business. The third deal we're looking at is Tata Communications' acquisition of the Tyco Global Network. This acquisition is one that most people have probably never heard of, but it played a major role in Tata's global expansion. In 2004, VSNL, which later became Tata Communications, acquired the Tyco Global Network for around $130 million. And what Tata was buying was not a normal company. It was buying a massive network of submarine fiber optic cables running across the ocean floor and connecting major parts of the world. These cables are part of the physical infrastructure that carries internet and telecommunications traffic between continents. So when Tata acquired the network, it gained control of a major piece of global communications infrastructure. That deal helped lay the foundation for what Tata Communications would eventually become, one of the world's major providers of international digital and network infrastructure. Most people imagine the internet as something completely wireless and invisible. But a huge amount of global data still travels through physical cables lying at the bottom of the ocean. And through this acquisition, an Indian company became the owner of a significant part of that infrastructure. The fourth deal we're looking at is Tata Tea's acquisition of Tetley. Long before Tata bought Jaguar Land Rover, it had already made another major move in Britain. In 2000, Tata Tea acquired Tetley in a deal worth around £400 million, including the debt it took on as part of the purchase. At the time, it was the largest cross-border acquisition ever made by an Indian company. And Tetley was not just another tea brand. It was one of the biggest tea companies in the world, with a huge presence in markets like the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada. The acquisition instantly gave Tata a much stronger international presence and helped transform it from a largely Indian tea company into a global consumer business. Over time, Tata Tea became Tata Global Beverages, and later Tata Consumer Products, but Tetley remained one of the most recognizable brands in its portfolio. So today, when someone in London, New York, or Toronto makes a cup of Tetley tea, they are buying from a brand owned by an Indian company. And that is what made this deal so important. Tata did not just buy factories or production capacity. It bought a brand that was already part of the daily routine of millions of households around the world. The fifth deal we're looking at is Tata Chemicals' acquisition of Brunner Mond and General Chemical. Tata Chemicals acquires Brunner Mond and General Chemical. Now we move away from famous consumer brands and into something much less glamorous, but arguably just as important. In 2005, Tata Chemicals acquired Brunner Mond, a British chemicals company with roots going back to the 19th century. Then in 2008, Tata Chemicals made another major move by acquiring General Chemical Industrial Products in the United States for roughly $1 billion. Both companies were major producers of soda ash. Now, soda ash is not something most people think about, but it is used everywhere. It is a key ingredient in making glass, detergents, chemicals, and many other industrial products. And by acquiring these businesses, Tata Chemicals dramatically expanded its global manufacturing footprint. The deals helped make Tata Chemicals one of the largest soda ash producers in the world, with operations spread across multiple continents. The sixth and final Tata deal we're looking at is Indian Hotels Company's acquisition of the Ritz-Carlton Boston. Indian Hotels Company, better known through its Taj Hotels brand, is part of the Tata Group. So for our final Tata acquisition, we move into luxury hospitality. In 2006, Indian Hotels Company acquired the Ritz-Carlton Boston. It was one of Boston's most prestigious luxury properties, located in one of America's oldest and most historic cities. Over the years, the hotel had hosted presidents, celebrities, business leaders, and generations of wealthy guests. After the acquisition, the property was renamed Taj Boston. So for the next 10 years, one of Boston's most famous luxury hotel addresses operated under a Tata-owned Indian hospitality company. But this one was not permanent. In 2016, Indian Hotels Company sold the property for around $125 million, and the hotel eventually became what is now known as the Newbury Boston. But that does not make the acquisition any less significant. For an entire decade, a Tata Group company owned and operated one of the most recognizable luxury hotels in one of America's most prestigious cities. And with that, we move on to the next deal, which takes us to another Indian industrial giant. The seventh deal we're looking at is Hindalco's acquisition of Novelis. Hindalco acquires Novelis. In 2007, Hindalco Industries, part of the Aditya Birla Group, acquired Novelis for approximately $6 billion. Novelis was one of the biggest names in rolled aluminium and aluminium recycling, with operations spread across North America, South America, Europe, and Asia. The acquisition completely changed Hindalco's global position. Instead of simply producing aluminium in India, Hindalco now owned a company that supplied high-value aluminium products to customers around the world. That includes aluminium used in beverage cans, packaging, and even body panels for major automobile companies. So some of the aluminium you see on cars driving through American or European cities may have been produced by a company ultimately owned by an Indian business. And that is what made this acquisition so important. Hindalco was no longer simply supplying raw material. It had moved much further up the global value chain. The eighth deal takes us from aluminium to something completely different, and that is Scotch whiskey. UB Group acquires White & Mackay. In 2007, the UB Group, led by Vijay Mallya, acquired Scottish whiskey producer White & Mackay for around £595 million. Scotch whisky is deeply connected to Scotland's identity, history, and culture. Even the way Scotch is produced is protected under British law. Yet for several years, one of Scotland's major whisky companies was owned by this Indian business group. White and Mackay itself had a long history and controlled several whisky brands with roots stretching back to the 19th century. In 2014, the company was sold to the Philippines-based Emperador for around £430 million, following wider changes involving United Spirits and Diageo. The ninth deal moves us into technology. HCL Technologies acquires Axon Group. In 2008, HCL Technologies acquired the British consulting company Axon Group for approximately £441 million, or around $800 million at the time. Axon specialized in SAP consulting. In simple terms, it helped large companies install and manage some of the complex software systems they use to run their businesses. And Axon was highly respected in this field. It worked with major companies across several countries and had the kind of consulting expertise that allowed it to work directly with senior executives inside large corporations. For HCL, that was extremely valuable. The deal helped the company move beyond the traditional image of Indian IT companies, simply providing cheaper offshore technical work. HCL was now competing for high-level consulting projects directly inside Western companies. More importantly, it reflected something Indian technology companies had already been proving for years, that they had the talent, technical depth, and business capability to compete with the world's biggest firms on equal terms. The 10th deal we're looking at is Wipro's acquisition of Infocrossing. Wipro acquires Infocrossing. In 2007, Wipro acquired the American IT infrastructure company Infocrossing for around $600 million. The acquisition gave Wipro a much stronger presence inside the United States. Instead of managing everything remotely from India, Wipro now had more employees, infrastructure, customers, and operations directly on American soil. And this was important because Indian technology companies were trying to change how Western businesses saw them. They wanted to become long-term technology partners capable of managing critical business infrastructure from inside the markets they served. Infocrossing helped Wipro move closer to that goal. The 11th deal we're looking at is Wipro's acquisition of Capco. Wipro acquires Capco. Fast forward to 2021. Wipro made the largest acquisition in its history, buying Capco for approximately $1.45 billion. Capco is a global consulting company focused heavily on banking and financial services. Its employees work directly with major financial institutions on technology, digital transformation, regulations, and business strategy. And that makes this deal very different from the Infocrossing acquisition 14 years earlier. Infocrossing helped Wipro prove that an Indian company could manage technology infrastructure inside America. Capco helped Wipro compete for something even more valuable: strategic consulting work inside some of the world's largest banks. The difference between those two acquisitions shows just how far Indian IT companies had moved. From supporting Western businesses behind the scenes to helping decide how those businesses should operate, the 12th deal takes us from information technology to renewable energy. Suzlon Energy acquires Repower Systems. Beginning in 2007, Indian wind energy company Suzlon started building a controlling stake in Germany's Repower Systems. Over the following years, Suzlon eventually gained full control of the company, spending well over €1 billion through a series of transactions. And Germany was an important place to make this acquisition. The country had developed some of the world's most advanced wind energy engineering and manufacturing expertise. By acquiring Repower, Suzlon gained direct access to that technology, talent, and European manufacturing base. For a period, the deal helped Suzlon become one of the world's largest wind turbine manufacturers. But this is also one of the deals on our list that did not have a happy ending. Suzlon later ran into serious financial and debt problems. Repower, which had been renamed Senvion, was eventually sold to American private equity firm Centerbridge Partners in 2015 for around 1 billion euros. So this was not a permanent acquisition, but for several years, a major part of German wind energy engineering was controlled by an Indian company. The 13th deal takes us into one of the most strategically important industries of all, energy. ONGC acquires Imperial Energy. Between 2008 and 2009, ONGC acquired Imperial Energy in a deal valued at roughly $2 billion. ONGC Videsh is the international investment arm of India's state-owned oil and natural gas corporation. Imperial Energy, meanwhile, was a British-listed oil exploration company with major assets in Russia. At the time, this became India's largest overseas oil and gas acquisition. And the reason behind the deal was straightforward: energy security. India imports a large portion of the crude oil it consumes. So instead of simply purchasing oil from foreign suppliers, ONGC Videsh was trying to own some of the resources directly. The investment later faced criticism over its performance and returns. But the strategic idea behind it was much bigger. India was not simply buying oil, but also the business that controlled the oil fields. The 14th deal continues that energy story, but this time in Britain. Essar Energy acquires Stanlow Refinery. In 2011, Essar Energy acquired the Stanlow Refinery from Shell for approximately $350 million. Stanlow was one of the largest oil refineries in the United Kingdom and supplied fuel across large parts of northwest England. So this was not simply a consumer brand or an office building, it was critical energy infrastructure. For roughly a decade, an Indian business controlled an important part of Britain's fuel processing infrastructure. And that is a very different kind of acquisition from buying a famous brand. Sometimes the most strategically important assets are the ones consumers almost never see. The 15th deal brings us back to a famous British brand. TVS Motor acquires Norton Motorcycles. In 2020, TVS Motor acquired the historic British motorcycle company Norton for approximately £16 million. Norton was one of the oldest and most famous names in British motorcycling, with more than a century of history and a long racing heritage. But by 2020, Norton was in serious trouble. The company had entered administration after facing major financial and reputational problems. TVS stepped in and acquired the business. Since then, it has invested in rebuilding the company and its manufacturing operations in Britain. So this was not simply an Indian company buying a successful British brand and collecting the profits. It was closer to a rescue. The 16th deal takes us into lighting. Havells India acquires Sylvania. In 2007, Havells India acquired the European lighting company Sylvania for approximately $300 million. What made this deal unusual was the size difference. At the time, Sylvania was reportedly around 1.5 times larger than Havells itself. So this was not a giant company swallowing a smaller competitor. It was an Indian company taking the risk of buying a foreign business larger than itself. Havells spent the following years restructuring and improving Sylvania's operations. Then in 2015, Havells sold its stake for around 1,340 crore rupees. For a company that had once been known mainly inside India, that was a remarkable demonstration of just how far Indian businesses had become capable of operating on the global stage. The 17th entry is actually two acquisitions made in the same year. Bharat Forge acquires Federal Forge and CDP Aluminium Technic. In 2004, Bharat Forge acquired Federal Forge in the United States and CDP Aluminium Technic in Germany. These were important moves because Bharat Forge operates in one of the most demanding areas of manufacturing, automotive and industrial components. By acquiring companies inside the United States and Germany, Bharat Forge gained manufacturing capacity directly inside two of the world's most advanced automotive markets. And remember, this was happening in 2004. Long before the current global conversation about India becoming a major manufacturing hub. Instead of waiting for Western companies to bring manufacturing work to India, Bharat Forge went directly into Western markets and bought manufacturing businesses there. That was an early sign of how Indian industrial companies were beginning to think globally. The 18th deal takes us to the Netherlands. In 2009, Apollo Tyres acquired Dutch premium tire manufacturer Vredestein. Vredestein gave the Indian company an established premium European tire brand, manufacturing facilities in the Netherlands, and direct access to European customers. This acquisition remained an important part of Apollo's international business. The combined operation became Apollo Vredestein and continues to serve as a major European base for the company. The 19th entry again involves two major acquisitions. In 2011, Motherson acquired an 80% stake in Germany's Pegaform. Then, in 2017, it acquired Finland's PKC Group in a deal worth a little over $600 million. Pegaform manufactures interior and exterior parts for automobiles. PKC specializes in electrical wiring systems, particularly for commercial vehicles. These may not be household names, but that is exactly what makes Motherson's story interesting. Most consumers never think about who makes the dashboard, bumpers, door panels, wiring, or other components inside their cars. Yet through acquisitions like these, Motherson grew from an Indian auto parts supplier into one of the world's major automotive component companies. So someone driving a European vehicle may be surrounded by components made by businesses controlled by an Indian company without ever knowing the Motherson name. The 20th deal moves us into pharmaceuticals. In 2006, Dr. Reddy's Laboratories acquired German pharmaceutical company Beta Pharm for €480 million, or roughly $570 million at the time. This was one of the largest overseas acquisitions made by an Indian pharmaceutical company up to that point, and Germany was an important market to enter. Its pharmaceutical industry is heavily regulated, highly competitive, and known for demanding strict quality standards. By purchasing an established German generics company, Dr. Reddy's gained a much stronger position directly inside the European pharmaceutical market. It was another step in the transformation of Indian pharma. Indian companies were no longer simply manufacturing lower-cost medicines in India and exporting them abroad. They were increasingly buying established pharmaceutical businesses inside Western markets themselves. The 21st deal takes us to the United States. In 2015, Lupin acquired Gavus Pharmaceuticals and its affiliate Novel Laboratories for $880 million. The deal significantly expanded Lupin's presence in the American generic drug market. The United States is one of the most valuable and competitive pharmaceutical markets in the world. Instead of relying only on exporting medicines from India, Lupin gained direct access to an American pharmaceutical company, its development pipeline, and its manufacturing capabilities. Indian pharmaceutical companies were no longer only suppliers to the American market. Increasingly, they were becoming owners inside it. The 22nd deal follows a slightly different path. Sun Pharma had already owned a majority stake in Detroit-based Caraco for several years, but in 2011, it completed the acquisition of the remaining publicly held shares for approximately $188 million. That gave Sun Pharma complete ownership. And what makes this deal interesting is how slowly it happened. Sun did not arrive and buy everything at once. It gradually built its position over several years before finally taking full control. The result was direct ownership of pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity inside the United States. The 23rd deal takes us to another major Indian pharmaceutical company. Cipla announced the acquisition of Invagen Pharmaceuticals and HCL Pharmaceuticals in 2015, completing the transactions in 2016. Together, the deals were worth around $550 million. The acquisitions gave Cipla something extremely valuable: direct manufacturing and commercial operations inside the United States. For decades, Cipla had been known primarily as an Indian manufacturer of affordable medicines. Now it had its own pharmaceutical operations on American soil. And that captures the wider change happening across Indian pharma. The companies that once entered Western markets mainly by exporting cheaper medicines were increasingly buying businesses inside those markets themselves. The 24th deal moves us from medicine to consumer products. In 2011, Dabur India acquired American personal care company Namaste Laboratories for $100 million. Namaste was particularly strong in hair care products designed for African American and multicultural consumers. That made this acquisition very different from simply launching an Indian product in America. Dabur was buying an existing American company with its own customers, brands, distribution network, and understanding of a very specific consumer market. And that is a much more sophisticated way to expand internationally. Instead of asking American customers to discover Dabur from scratch, Dabur bought a business those customers already knew. The 25th entry takes us to motorcycles. In 2015, Mahindra acquired a controlling 51% stake in Peugeot Motorcycles, the historic French scooter and motorcycle company. Then just 1 year later, Mahindra acquired BSA Company, Birmingham Small Arms, one of Britain's most historic motorcycle brands. So within a very short period, Mahindra had gained control of two famous European motorcycling names. The stories later went in different directions. Mahindra eventually sold its stake in Peugeot Motorcycles in 2022. BSA, however, remained under Mahindra ownership and was relaunched with new motorcycles. An Indian company was buying European automotive heritage itself. The 26th deal shows another side of India's technology expansion. In 2018, Infosys acquired Seattle-based creative agency Wong Doody for approximately $75 million. And this acquisition was unusual for Infosys. The company was known around the world primarily for technology and IT services. Wong Doody, on the other hand, specialized in advertising, design, branding, and digital experiences. So Infosys was moving beyond simply building the technology behind a company's digital products. It was also moving into the creative side, deciding what those products should look like and how customers should experience them. That is another sign of how the role of Indian technology companies has evolved. They are no longer satisfied with simply engineering someone else's idea. Increasingly, they want to help create the idea as well. The 27th entry brings us to Tech Mahindra. In 2016, Tech Mahindra acquired British digital consultancy the Bio Agency for approximately $66 million. It also acquired Lightbridge Communications Corporation, an American telecommunications services company, and the two companies gave Tech Mahindra very different capabilities. Bio strengthened its digital and creative consulting business in Britain. Lightbridge strengthened its telecom infrastructure expertise in the United States. Two companies, two countries, two very different areas of expertise. But both acquisitions serve the same larger purpose, making Tech Mahindra a broader international business rather than simply an Indian IT outsourcing company. The 28th deal takes us deep into industrial materials. In 2013, Rain Industries, then known as Rain Commodities, acquired Rutgers in a deal worth approximately $915 million. Rutgers operated in Germany and Belgium and produced specialized carbon-based industrial materials. These materials are used in industries such as aluminium production and other heavy manufacturing. And chances are, most people watching this have never heard of Rutgers. But that is precisely the point. Some of the most important companies in the global economy are almost invisible to ordinary consumers because their products sit deep inside industrial supply chains. Through this acquisition, Rain Industries became a major global player in those supply chains. It may not own a famous consumer brand, but it owns businesses that help make the products those famous brands depend on. The 29th deal takes us back to consumer products. In 2005, Godrej Consumer Products acquired British personal care company Keyline Brands for around 120 crore rupees, or roughly $27 million at the time. Compared with the billion-dollar acquisitions elsewhere on this list, this was relatively small, but strategically it mattered. It was one of Godrej's early moves from simply exporting Indian products into Western markets to directly owning Western consumer brands. And that is worth remembering. Sometimes the first step into a foreign market begins with a much smaller deal that gives a company local brands, customers, and distribution. The 30th deal takes us into agriculture. In 2019, UPL completed the acquisition of Arista Life Science for approximately $4.2 billion. This was one of the largest overseas acquisitions ever completed by an Indian company, and it transformed UPL almost immediately. The deal helped make it one of the world's largest agrochemical companies. Agrochemicals may not sound glamorous, but they are central to modern agriculture. These companies produce many of the crop protection products farmers use to grow food efficiently at enormous scale. So with this acquisition, an Indian company moved into the top tier of one of the most strategically important industries in the world. The 31st deal brings the Aditya Birla Group back onto our list. In 2011, the Aditya Birla Group, through Birla Carbon, acquired American company Colombian Chemicals for approximately $875 million. The acquisition helped make Birla Carbon the largest carbon black producer in the world. Now, carbon black is another product most consumers rarely think about, but it is used in tires, plastics, coatings, inks, and countless industrial products. So once again, we see the same pattern. Some Indian companies were not chasing famous consumer brands. They were buying businesses sitting much deeper inside the global supply chain. And when you control those materials, thousands of other companies depend on what you produce. The 32nd deal takes us back to steel. In 2007, SR acquired Canadian steel producer Algoma Steel for somewhere between $1.6 and $1.85 billion. Algoma was a major part of Canada's industrial economy and one of Ontario's important steel employers. For SR, it was another enormous overseas expansion, but this acquisition also had a difficult ending. SR later ran into broader financial problems, and Algoma went through restructuring before eventually returning as an independent, publicly traded company. For a period of time, one of Canada's major steel companies was controlled by an Indian industrial group, and that deserves to be part of the story just as much as the acquisitions that succeeded permanently. Before we enter the final stretch, there is something worth noticing. Look back at the companies we have covered so far. Yes, there are famous names, Jaguar, Land Rover, Tetley, Norton, but many of the biggest deals were in things like soda ash, aluminium, carbon black, wiring systems, refineries, pharmaceuticals, and telecommunications infrastructure. India's corporate expansion into the West was never only about buying famous brands. Much of it happened quietly, inside the industrial systems and supply chains that keep modern economies running. The 33rd entry takes us to Italy. In 2018, JSW Steel became involved in reviving the historic Piombino steel complex in Italy. And this deal is slightly different from the straightforward acquisitions we have covered so far. There was no single simple purchase price. Instead, the project involved acquisitions, restructuring, and continued investment into the Italian steel operation. JSW's Italian business later announced additional investment worth around 140 million euros in 2024. What makes this story important is not simply the money. It is the fact that an Indian steel company became involved in trying to revive a historic European industrial site. It is more complicated than a simple Indian company buys Western company headline. But it still shows how deeply Indian businesses have entered industries that were once considered almost entirely European territory. The 34th deal takes us back into American pharmaceuticals. In 2011, Zydus Cadila, also known at the time as Cadila Healthcare, acquired manufacturing assets from Nesher Pharmaceuticals in the United States. It strengthened Zydus's position inside the American pharmaceutical industry and gave it additional manufacturing capabilities directly inside the United States. And once again, we see the same transformation. An Indian pharmaceutical company that was once known mainly inside India now owned pharmaceutical infrastructure on American soil. And finally, we reach the 36th acquisition on our list. In 2010, KEC International, part of the RPG Group, acquired SAE Towers Holdings for approximately $95 million. SAE Towers was headquartered in Texas and manufactured electricity transmission towers, with additional operations in Brazil and Mexico. The deal helped make KEC one of the world's major transmission tower manufacturers. And this feels like an appropriate company to end the list with. Because transmission towers are exactly the kind of infrastructure most people use every day without ever wondering who manufactures them. They stand across highways, cities, and countryside, carrying electricity across enormous distances. And some of that manufacturing capacity came under Indian ownership more than a decade ago, which brings us back to the larger point of this entire video. Many of India's most important overseas acquisitions were never designed to become household names. They were designed to become indispensable. Some of these companies remain under Indian ownership today. Others were owned for several years and eventually sold, and some acquisitions simply did not work out. But taken together, they reveal a side of India's economic rise that rarely gets discussed. For years, the most common story about India's role in the global economy focused on outsourcing, inexpensive labor, and Western companies investing in India. That story was simply incomplete. Because while Western companies were investing in India, Indian companies were also going in the opposite direction. They were buying factories, buying brands, buying technology, distribution networks, and natural resources. These deals were not simply handed to them. Indian companies had to negotiate with global corporations, compete against other buyers, raise billions of dollars in financing, take enormous risks, and then actually operate the businesses they had purchased. India went from being seen mainly as a destination for foreign investment to becoming a source of major foreign investment itself. And that may be the most important takeaway from this entire list. I know this video was a little longer than usual, but once we started researching the topic, the list just kept getting more incredible and more interesting. There were so many deals, stories, and details worth including that we felt it was better to cover as much as we could. So again, thank you for giving us your time and for staying with us until the end. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one.